All right, so let me go over some important dates and things to remember in terms of the competition. So the first upcoming deadline, and probably one of the more important ones, is the registration deadline. So if you haven't already done so, and I believe a lot of you have, please register for the competition itself. So to be eligible for Grad Slam, you need to be currently registered and enrolled in winter quarter here on campus. And Vanya just dropped the registration link in the chat. Registering for the competition is completely low stakes. You have nothing to lose by registering for Grad Slam. It's the easiest part of the competition. So we highly recommend that you just put your name in there. You know, if you decide not to submit a video, nothing happens. So just register. So deadline for that is tomorrow. So if you know anyone who would be great for this or remotely interested, please encourage them to do so. And yourself, remember to register yourself in the competition. Once you've registered for the competition, you will get the links to the small group coaching sessions, which are happening next week. Now, the next important deadline is the preliminary video submission deadline, which is Monday, February 12th. So in order to be eligible to receive a $50 gift card for the preliminary round, you need to attend one of the small group coaching sessions next week and then submit your video on Monday, February 12th. Okay, so attend small group coaching session. And when you attend the small group coaching session, we will expect you to participate in the small group coaching session by doing a run through of your presentation, sharing a slide if you have one, and then, just participating in it in general. And then you go to small group coaching session and then submit your video on the 12th. And we will, again, you will receive links to small group coaching session once you register. After everyone has submitted their video on the 12th, from there, we will select 20 semifinalists to compete in 2 in-person semifinal rounds on Tuesday, March 5th. So those are in-person and no video component of that whatsoever. Those are happening in person. And the rounds will be held in Kirchhoff Grand Salon on Tuesday, March 5th. We have a morning and an afternoon round. From the semifinalists, we will select 10 to compete in our final competition on Tuesday, April 2nd. And that will happen at the Luskin Conference Center here on campus. Okay, so video deadline, February 12th. If you're thinking optimistically, semifinals, Tuesday, March 5th. And even further beyond that, Tuesday, April 2nd is the final competition. From the final competition, our campus champion will then compete with the other UC champions up in San Francisco for the UC-wide competition happening in May. Okay. And then also this year, the day after the final competition on Wednesday, April 3, we will have a lunch with Dean Etner and other distinguished guests with our finalists. So that's another thing to note on the calendar. And then Vanya dropped the link to our website, which has all the important dates, workshop materials, presentation guidelines, and, judging information on there as well. She dropped the link in the chat, so feel free to visit our website at any point to get further detail with Grad Slam. Also, if you have any questions about the competition, you're not sure about something, please send us a message through askgrad@grad.ucla.edu with the subject line Grad Slam, and we will try to get back to you as quickly as possible. Okay. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Francesca, who will be leading our workshop today.
Thank you, Ivy. Hello, everyone. My name is Francesca Gaccio. I'm the coordinator of postdoctoral scholar appointments in the Division of Graduate Education, and I'll lead you through our workshop today. Let me share my slide. On finessing your slide, tips and tricks for your Grad Slam slide. I'll try to keep this quite lean, but we will be looking at samples of presentations with animations. We'll look at photos of former participants to kind of get a sense of how others have used their optional PowerPoint slide in their presentations. So if you have any questions at any point, please drop them in the chat. My colleagues from the Grad Slam team will be monitoring the chat and will answer questions that are that they can. And we'll also have some time at the end to go through your questions. So as you'll see on this slide, there's going to be a QR code that will take you directly to the 2024 Grad Slam page on the UCLA Graduate Division of Graduate Education website. You're welcome to scan that whenever you need to look up anything, and Vanya also provided the links in the chat. So as we start, I just want us to kind of think about kind of take some temperature in the room, right? And this is the only time I'll ask for audience participation. I know sometimes that's not cool in the Zoom workshop, but using your Zoom raise hand function, or if you're on camera, you can just raise your hand on your screen, and I'll be able to see folks here. Raise your hand if you have sat through a really long PowerPoint presentation and you didn't remember anything. All right. And I hope that it's not this. I'm hoping. All right. So we've all been there, right? Most of us have been there. Now, raise your hand or keep your hand raised if you have given a really long PowerPoint presentation and wondered if anyone remembered anything. So never a worry, okay? Right. So what we have here is basically we have been subjected to, and we have subjected others to PowerPoint presentations that may not have been as compelling, as interesting, or there's just a lot of content to get through that kind of left us a little unsure about the engagement of the audience, or perhaps what stuck with them. And so that's really our topic of discussion today. We are going to look through examples of presentations that have helped audiences to remember what they said, right? So people will forget most of the information you give them. And this is just something that has to do with people's attention spans. But we can choose what they remember with a visual aid. Right. Now, I put an asterisk there in the visual aid because not everything can be made sticky, right? Sticky with visual aids. Sometimes folks remember better when there's a clever or moving opening, if there's a story associated with the information, or perhaps you've provided a really good example, right? And so these are all options for you to kind of think about how to help your audience remember your topic. But for our purposes today, we're going to talk about how visual aids in a PowerPoint slide can be used effectively in your presentation so that we can help our audiences remember the information we're giving them. So in this workshop, I will be posing some questions to you to reflect on as you prepare your recorded talks for Grad Slam, or to consider when presenting with a PowerPoint that will help you decide how to best use a visual aid like a PowerPoint slide to augment and complement your talk. So along the way, we'll look at examples from former Grad Slam participants, but keep in mind that the ones I'm going to be showing are not objectively the best slides. Rather, I want us to look at these examples so that we can take inspiration from them and perhaps even consider that maybe you don't need a slide for Grad Slam. And so we begin with our first question, and it's an important one, right? Before you even go open PowerPoint on your computer. And that's, what is the purpose of your slide? Ask yourself, will your slide, or will my slide, illustrate a key point, demonstrate examples, emphasize a central idea, or evoke strong feelings or impressions, right? And I want you to ask yourself these questions because the answer could very well be that you won't need a slide for any of these purposes and you don't actually need to create one, right? And remember that for the competition, the slide is optional, right? So you have one slide with animations are acceptable, but remember that there will be no points for visuals, right? You will not be evaluated or scored based on your use of visuals and animations. So if you feel like the slide is not going to be crucial to your talk, you don't have to use it, right? Feel free to just reject that part and focus on the script and focus on the presentation. However, if you do decide to use it, we can talk about some principles and some questions you want to think about when approaching the design strategy for your PowerPoint slide. Ultimately, our goal when designing a PowerPoint slide should be to balance information with attention, right? And so I didn't ask this at the top, but probably as part of that really long PowerPoint that you sat through or you made others sit through, our slides that probably had a lot of information packed into, several slides, right? And so part of what we're going to talk about here today is to see how others have consolidated really complex research into images, into a set of words, into a set of phrases that really help to augment their talk and help the audience get a better understanding of their topic. And I mentioned this earlier, we want to use the slide to augment and complement your talk, right? Remember that you are the presentation, not the PowerPoint slide. And so that's something to really think about when using your visual aids. They're intended to complement and augment the presentation. So let's say that in, I don't know, the last 7 minutes, you've pondered on this and you decided that you wanted to use a slide. How do we go about that? Well, we have two options on how you want to approach the use of your slide. You can either ignore your slide or reference it, right? So these are our two options. I give you these two options because it will determine how you are going to deploy visual elements in your talk and how ultimately you're going to be interacting with the screen, right, that will be next to you, or perhaps the screen that you will be looking at as you're recording your presentations. So what does these two approaches mean? The ignore it example here, ignoring your slide means you are using the image or images as a backdrop, right? One goal you might achieve by using this approach is to take your audience on a journey verbally primarily, and then visually secondarily, right? So you're really focusing on the images kind of enhancing your talk. So by that, I mean the images aren't really playing a significant part, but they're reinforcing a feeling or an idea. So like these two examples that we have here, but the focus is on the talk itself, right? So you'll see on the left here with the germ and probably a physician playing chess, there's an image, there's a tone, there's a feeling that is potentially complementing that talk, right? When you're using this approach, the image should speak clearly to the audience since you will not be providing the context around it, right? You're ignoring it, so you're not constantly pointing to it, pointing out things to it. The image should be clear and focused, so that means good quality, high resolution, and easily accessible, right? And by that, I mean the images should not be too complicated or too abstract that at first glance, people are kind of lingering too much on the image that they're forgetting to listen to you. So for using this approach, I would recommend using a representative image because it will communicate much more clearly and quickly, especially if the image refers to something we can all easily define, right? Unless, of course, abstraction is the point of your talk, right? So then you just throw that out the window if the whole point of the talk is to kind of communicate that there's something inexplicable or abstract about your topic that your talk is going to illuminate. The second approach is what we're calling the reference it approach. So it requires you to directly engage with the images and texts you provide in your slide, right? So to do this effectively, you'll want to choose a brief section, right? Maybe 15 to 30 seconds in your talk to draw the audience's attention to the slide. When you're using this approach, it's important to be specific and direct, right? But it's also best to plan when to create the effect, right? At what moment to bring the image in, when to highlight it, and how to draw your audience back to your speaking, right? Because sometimes when we're listening to someone talk and they bring in an image, sometimes we don't know when we're supposed to look away and when we're supposed to pay attention back to the speaker, or are we supposed to keep looking, right? So this is also a challenge that you might want to think through about when you're using a reference it approach. So here's another photo of someone using a reference approach. Some motivations for using it might be to explain complex ideas, right? So you might need to refer to certain language, show a picture or highlight a picture that corresponds with a certain part of your talk. Or you might want to visually summarize key project elements, like in this photo, where there's a chart and then there is a kind of a red like square around certain numbers, right? And so regardless of your choice of approach, you should not rely on your slide to convey the entire message, right? Because remember, you're the talk. This is really intended to just complement your presentation. So that's the first question, right? Like, what purpose is my slide serving? So design your slide to augment and complement your talk. Decide if you will be ignoring it or referencing it during your 3-minute talk. And lastly, don't rely on your slide to convey your entire message. Let me just take a quick look. No questions yet in the chat. Okay. So we'll move on to kind of the second set of questions here, which is how should I design my slide, right? So let's say you've made these initial decisions already as to the purpose and approach of your PowerPoint slide. So now you'd want to consider design strategy, right? We're going to talk about different ways you can utilize and even maximize the space of a 16:9 PowerPoint slide, right? And so remember that your PowerPoint slides have to use the 16:9 ratio, which is usually the default in all of the new PowerPoints. But if it looks a little wonky, always double check the size of that slide. So we'll go through 3 design strategies at a time with some examples. So the first one you could consider would be using one image for the entire slide. You could also consider designing graphics or combining images. And you could also use the slide as a grid with sections. And we'll talk about each of these and show you some examples. So the first design strategy, right, one image for the entire slide is pretty straightforward. Right? You are basically using the entire slide to project your image like a photo or an illustration. And this approach is simple and it helps to create a focal point for the audience, often creating one visual message, right? And this is particularly important because you'd want the audience to focus on your talk. So this is an example from 2023's UCLA Grad Slam champion, Kelsey Rutledge. On this slide, you might have to adjust some contrast. It's a very dark picture. But on this slide, the speaker has decided to use a single image. So this is a picture of a skate, which is a relative of a stingray. And in their talk, they used this slide to introduce a familiar looking sea creature, but one that might not be as well known as a stingray. So let's take a couple of seconds to just kind of clock this picture, right? Kind of process what we're seeing. Try to see the image for any context of what it is that it could be. And if you're willing and able, type in the chat some initial thoughts you're having about this image. What immediate impressions you might be thinking about. what this image might be evoking. And I'll pause for a couple of seconds here to see if others have ideas. Okay. Deep ocean. Okay, someone thought it was a stingray, right? Which is partly the point, right? Like we would have seen this and looked at a stingray, and Kelsey would have told us, nope, not quite a stingray, right? And so immediately we're accessing prior knowledge. Someone mentioned maybe it's endangered, getting a space vibe from the Black background, right? So there's potentially a space kind of visual space context here that we're getting. Something about ocean life, right? And why should I care about this funky creature? Very good question indeed, right? So it's already kind of eliciting curiosity to a degree. So why might this image be effective? First, when we use a simple image like the one we just saw, it can be very effective in focusing the audience to the message or the topic, right? That this image is conveying. So in this case, we're all focused on this relative of the stingray, right? And we're curious, like must be in deep, deep, dark ocean space, right? We're kind of accessing a lot of information already, even with a simple photo. The image is also quite compelling, right? It's swimming in the dark and we see the general shape of the animal. And it's a relatively clear picture. And if we look more closely, I don't know how closely you were able to look, but there's some shades of gray, in the bottom left that seem like rocks on the ocean floor. So we kind of get a sense that this is very much deep sea, deep ocean, right? Now, for this design strategy, this can be used for a reference it or ignore it approach, right? So depending on what that image is. But remember that it depends on the image that you use, right? If you're talking about this creature throughout the talk, maybe it doesn't need to be referred to. If you're only talking about it for a little bit, it might be good to refer to it. But let's also think about how this image might not work for other audiences, right? Is it too mysterious? Like if I didn't know what a stingray was, would I know what I'm looking at, right? If we don't immediately know what it is it distracting, right? And again, related to this first question, does the image need further explanation, right? Which means it would be better to use it in the reference it approach. Okay. Now let's move on to our second strategy, designing graphics or combining images. So this approach allows you to visually represent complex information, such as depicting a process or providing an example to be more easily understood. So we're going to look at, I think I said three. Yeah, we're going to look at 3 examples of this strategy. Here's our first one for combining images or designing visuals. This one is from last year's finalist, Alex Quaco. So let's walk through this image, right? So we have the 3 background images covering the entirety of the page. On the left, we have an image of what looks like scores being held up by the crowd. In the middle, an image of a young student on a laptop wearing a headset. And on the right side of the screen, we have a robot that looks like it's thinking with math equations in the background on maybe a chalkboard, or it's just in the background, right? We're not quite sure. And then superimposed at the top of these images is a series of icons and directional arrows suggesting a process of biasing or debiasing of some topic, right? We don't quite know what the topic is yet offhand, but we know that it has something to do with this process that's being described by the icons, these very simple icons, and then the arrows. So why might this this image be effective, right? before we talk about its effectiveness, let's kind of get a sense of what this image was about. Let me go back, right? So based on this image, we are likely to conclude that it has something to do with student learning, right? Because we have this student here. Perhaps something to do with algorithms or AI, right? And something to do with scores being held up, right? And that's reinforced by the icon on the lower left here, where it looks like a teacher holding a ruler and a notebook or a book, and then a cap, right, for graduation, and then a robot on the lower right, right? So perhaps we're thinking something to do with algorithms, testing, scoring, and student learning, right? And so if those were some of the thoughts that came to you as you're looking at this image, we're somewhat on the right track, because the title of this presentation from Alex was Reducing Bias in Standardized Tests, right? And so we can kind of see how we might get there. So this might be effective for a number of reasons. First, the images are simple and crisp, right? The high resolution makes it easier to grasp what the images are. And the main ideas seem to be communicated by the icons in black and white. And the directional arrows are really helpful in showing relationships between the ideas, suggesting to us the main topic or issue has something to do with the relationships among these three things. But again, we also have to think about how might this be ineffective, right? Does the combination of images make it too abstract, right? Does it require too much processing for us? And depending on the approach, right, whether reference it or ignore it, can it be distracting if the speaker is continuing to talk about the research that they are doing, right? And so some things to always kind of think about when you're trying to balance multiple images in one slide. Here's another example for designing graphics to describe a process. The angle might be a little challenging, but for the in-person presentations, this is what it will likely look like, right? There's a screen behind you or to your side, and you're kind of up front, right in front of it, or off to the side. So in this example, there's two images, right? That's showing process. On the left is an example of nutrient cycling. It's titled Example of Nutrient Cycling. And on the right image is titled Wildfire Depositions, right? And you can see the use of arrows to denote a process there. Now, what's interesting about this use of images and arrows, right, is let's think about its overall effect. The images are colorful and they're relatively simple, right? We can easily kind of get a sense of what it is describing. And the titles of the images are very helpful in telling us what it is, right? But one thing that you also might want to think about is the length of phrases and words that you're using in your slide, right? The longer chain of words you have, the harder it is for the audience to read and listen to you while you're talking, right? So if you're going to use this approach and you feel like you need a lot of words, you might want to use a reference it approach and then to animate the words to appear when they are relevant. And we'll look at examples of that in just a couple of slides. And of course, this contestant might have done that, but this was back before 2023 when they were not allowed to use animations in previous years, right? And so I just want to reiterate that, like, when you're presenting, you don't want to split your audience's attention between reading and listening, because very likely they're probably going to read because it's going to be faster than listen, right? And so if at any point there's a lot of words on the screen, but you're saying different words to them, I think, also think about your own experiences when someone is showing you something, and you have to read something on the screen, but they're telling you something different, right? Or slightly different, how that divides your attention. Okay, Our final example in this approach is combining images with some overlapping animations, right? So I'd like us to take a couple of seconds to look at the slide. We will talk about animations a little bit later in this presentation, but let's take a look at this slide. Take note of what your eyes are immediately attracted to, what message you think the slide is conveying, and what impressions you are getting about the topic of this talk. You don't have to share in the chat, but do take note somewhere or make internal notes of how you are viewing this slide. So this is the slide from last year's finalist, Elaine, Jessica, Tamargo. I'm going to play through the animations so you can see how the images are appearing, disappearing, and reappearing throughout the talk. I'm not gonna do the 3-minute talk because it can take up too much of our time. But I want you to kind of follow through the animations, see how your attention is shifting and how you're processing information. Okay. So note how the image of the woman, right, thinking right here in the middle stays throughout the talk. And the slide opens with what do you want to be when you grow up, both at the beginning and at the end of the talk, right? Then we have kind of walking through it. We have an image of the Philippine flag showing up right here, followed by text, followed by a US flag, and then icons, right? That are, they look pretty easily recognizable. They're quite simple. Big check there. Additionally, then we close. So a couple of advantages with this approach to slide design is that when you combine images, you can tell a larger cohesive story, right? Because you have several images you can use to build information, right? Provided that they are organized appropriately, right? So thinking about this example and thinking about our reading patterns, our eyes draw from left to right, right? And so this slide also moves from left to right mostly, right, through the images. And because the images are side by side, I know we have here too much overlapping of the animations. It's allowing the audience to draw comparisons, right? And so if we were to redesign the slide, say, doing the images top to bottom instead of left to right, what effect might that have on the audience? Well, the audience might think that there's a hierarchical relationship instead of a comparison, right? When we do things from top to bottom, we naturally think of a hierarchy, or at least at first glance, we think of hierarchy. And depending on your talk, make sure that that's what you intend the audience to get from the arrangement of your combined images, right? And also, depending on the images that you use, you can help to suggest the tone of the talk and the central issue or topic. You'll note that all of these are illustrations, right? There are no like photos in the same way that Alex's slide had photos to create his PowerPoint, right? So that's also something to think about. Also keep in mind that if like too many words on a screen, too many images will also require more processing time for your audience, right? That might be competing with what you're saying to them. So this comes back again to how we might be splitting the audience's attention if we have photos that are a little too hard or takes a little longer to process. And so make sure you're keeping that in mind when selecting images or icons for your talk. But like we see in this example, our finalists use really simple, easy to grasp images that can help manage that, what could be cognitive overload, right? Kind of processing too many images at once. All right, this final design strategy is using the slide as a grid with sections. This might be really useful for managing your audience's attention, especially if you have a combination of images or you might want to depict a series of related thoughts or points. Now, what this allows you to do is to create momentum, but it also lets you split the screen or the slide into chunks, right? That can encourage better focus. This design will require a reference it approach. So this cannot be an ignore it approach. This cannot be a background slide. Motivations for doing this might be to explain complex ideas, or if you want to visually summarize key project elements. So this is an example from last year's finalist, Siddharth Shrivastava. As you'll see, when I click through the animations on the slide, each portion of the talk corresponds to a section on the slide, right? The first appears on the upper left corner, showing us a simple chart, 2 colors, numbers and denominations of 10, so it's a little bit easier to understand. Then the upper part of the slide fills up on the second click with an image showing a process. On the third click, a measurement shows up. Fourth click brings text to the slide, introducing a specific term, potentially describing a methodology, right? So actually that's clicks 4 and 5. Click 6, then an image that describes that method, like what happens with that method. And then our final click brings us to what looks like results and what they mean given to us in a chart. And then again, in the same or similar red and green colors of the initial slides, keeping the colors relatively in the same kind of color wheel, right? We're using basically the same colors throughout the slide. So why might this be effective? First, because the sections are animated in through clicks, it helps the audience work through the stages of the talk, right? Which helps with focus and with scaffolding information. This means you're not giving all of the information to your audience all at once, but giving it piecemeal and at appropriate times. But even without the use of animations, how the different elements are organized and the use of the lines to separate the screen tells us how the information is organized, right? So it tells us that like, oh, it's this 4 square type of image that I'm having to look at. This is particularly helpful when using a referenced approach. You'd want to choose a short window during your talk to draw the audience's attention to the slide. So you'd want to be specific and use signal language, right? So you can direct the audience's attention when looking at the slide. And you'd also want to use relatively the same words on the slide so that, again, we're not splitting the attention of the audience. Here's another example. This time from last year's UCLA champion and UCY champion, Brandon Tsai. As you'll see, the grid seems like it's broken up horizontally, right? So in the previous example, it's broken up into 4s. This one seems like it might be broken up into 2, the top half and the bottom half, right? At the top, we have these images, the word mutation, and at the bottom, we have some kind of chart or table. So I'm going to show you the animations in this slide so you can see how the slide was broken up. On its own, it probably doesn't make any sense, right? I know I don't know what I'm looking at when I'm looking at it, but we can infer that during the talk, the upper half is describing something, right? So let me walk through the animations. Right, and that's it. Right, so I think that was maybe 4 clicks, right, into the animation. And so we can see that the upper half of the slide is describing something, right? Some kind of process or perhaps helping us to envision some kind of phenomenon that he's describing. The bottom half tells us some kind of result. So we have this chart, we have some language here, we have the title, and then a bunch of X's, right, to show where things would have landed. I would strongly encourage you to view all of the presentations from last year, both from the Grad Slam, the UCLA finals and the UC-wide finals, because that's where you'll see how the presenters are really interacting or not with their PowerPoint slides, and what the timing is for, certain parts of the talk. And so that's a really useful guide for considering your own, not just your design strategy, but the timing with your talk. And Vanya just posted the link. Great synergy. Okay, so this is kind of our the three main design strategies that we just talked about. Remember that whichever design strategy you choose, make sure that the visual information that you are providing does not distract or detract, right, from comprehending your talk. So remember our first our earlier slide here about augmenting and complementing. Okay, questions so far before we talk about animations, and this won't be too long. Okay, I'll keep going. Y'all think about your questions, and we'll talk about how you can use animations in your slide. So just a reminder, no points for the visuals. I know I just spent the last 20 minutes talking about visuals, but you are not scored or evaluated based on your use of visuals. But even though you're not being scored on these, your PowerPoint slide can still contribute to the overall effectiveness of your talk if you deem it necessary, right? So again, that's kind of another decision point for you to make. So animations can be useful for a variety of reasons. As is the theme of our talk today, you always want to ask yourself questions whenever it comes to using any of the strategies we talked about today, right? So ask yourself, what does it add to my talk, right? What do animations add to my talk? Will it help create dramatic effect? Will it help you reiterate a central message or point? Does it help make the information more memorable? Or am I just using it to create engagement, right? Instead of using the content of the talk to resonate with your audience, right? So sometimes we get in the space of like, this slide just needs more oomph. It just needs more flash, right? Sometimes that's a good question to ask. I think sometimes we ask it too often and we end up adding too many animations on a slide, right? So really think about what's your intent in using the animation. If you're trying to engage the audience, I would recommend using the content of your talk to engage the audience rather than the animations of the images or the words. And then you also want to ask yourself, what effect does it create for the audience? Will it be distracting for them, or is the information accessible enough, right? And so this really is about not using the animation as sort of a crutch for, wanting to create dynamic presentations, which isn't always the case. So there are different kinds of animations on PowerPoint that you can use to effectively reach your audiences. PowerPoint organizes them as basic, subtle, moderate, and exciting. And as the category suggests, they describe the kind of movement the chosen animation in that category would produce, right? So try out different types, but always keep in mind that it should augment and complement your talk. PowerPoint also has exit animations, which, as the name says, animates objects out of a slide. And we'll have an example of that in just a little bit. But I would caution you about using the moderate or exciting categories in PowerPoint, and caution you against overusing them because they can be distracting, or worse, give your audience motion sickness. This has happened to me. Maybe it's just me, but if it's happened to me, I feel like it can happen to anyone. And so something to definitely think about. One animation I want to highlight that can be used effectively is the appear animation. You've seen it in a lot of our examples today. It's useful in scaffolding or staggering information because a lot of the text is hidden until you click. It prevents the audience from getting too far ahead of you when you're presenting, and it helps them to focus on the short words or images only when they are relevant. So what we have here is an example of an animation I used at the Grad Slam info session. And so with every click, right, more information comes up, but note that you're moving along as I'm moving along, right? I'm helping you catch up, but also everyone is relatively on the same page unless you are paying attention, right? So this is really a way to help pace the information for your audience. So it's good for staggering information if there's a lot of information, but it's also good for managing attention. So also think about the placement of your text. You'll see that in this design strategy, I'm using the slide as a grid, and I'm trying to build steps, right? It's going from the bottom corner, bottom right, left corner, bottom right, left corner of the screen, all the way to the upper right corner, right? I'm trying to build steps, but you also see that there's images to help reinforce that, right? By the use of arrows, and again, kind of this movement towards the top right part of the screen. Now, compare this to a combination of appear animations, right, which is an entrance animation, and a disappear animation, which is an exit animation. And I want you to pay attention to how your attention fluctuates and also how your memory fluctuates, right? Now, this approach, right, is useful because it draws the focus of the audience to one bit of information at a time. The challenge, though, is that you're likely straining the audience's short-term memory when one bit of information appears and then disappears, right? And so maybe it was fine in like the 3 seconds that I was clicking, but imagine the length of a 3-minute talk. And if things are disappearing and appearing, but you're needing that information towards the end, kind of think about how your audience might have already forgotten that. So if you want information to accumulate, this might not be the best strategy, right? This combination of appear and disappear animation. This is really more useful if you're trying to link information to each other, but they might not all build into something larger. I do also want to briefly mention the advantages of animating content out. It's a good option for drawing the attention back to you, the speaker, when you basically wipe the slide free of any words or images, right? It cues to your audience it's time to look back at you and listen. And so that's also a strategy. However you choose the animations, remember that you should be asking yourself if it's adding or subtracting to the talk. So here's an example. I'm on Zoom, so I can't like draw your attention back to my face. But ideally, right, like in a talk, removing all of that content encourages the audience to go back to listening. A few reminders as we wrap this up. Animations allow you to pack a lot of information into a slide, but remember to keep it simple, right? Again, we want to balance information that we give on the slide with the attention or memory of the audience. There are also very logistical, like practical considerations to make, right? The more animations that are on top of each other on a slide, the harder it is to import between laptops, and perhaps the higher the chances of technical challenges, right? Or technical difficulties. So really do keep that in mind. Use size and color and movement to your advantage, but always with good judgment, right? Think about the overall effect of every single visual element on your screen, and how that how that affects your audience. And finally, this is really important. Probably should have said this at the top. Practice the timing of your talk with the animations, right? Time it and make sure the animation is actually corresponding to the certain parts of your talk, right? There's nothing worse than an animation going right before something is needed, right? Or like a rogue, click or animation kind of getting ahead of the talk, because it can be very distracting. Some don'ts, or some less encouraged, right? Don't overcrowd your slide with images and animations, both for use of ease of the slide and also because you don't want to rely on the slide to convey everything, right? This is back to your part 1 of the talk. The slide is not the talk. Don't overuse the exciting category of animations on PowerPoint. If not, to just spare me because I will be watching the motion sickness. So if nothing else sticks today, because I talked a lot and I subjected you to a long PowerPoint presentation, if nothing else sticks, I hope you will remember that when you're designing your slide, if you choose to use it, that you should aim to balance information with attention, right? Keep this in mind and your audience will thank you. If you have any questions, here's it's a reminder from what Ivy mentioned. Please email askgrad@ucla.edu and put Grad Slam in your subject line. And I thank you for your attention, and we can now turn to questions. Lisa.
Lisa, thank you for that. It was very informative. So yesterday I actually watched half of the Grad Slam finals, and I was familiar with some of them. One person I don't remember, she did use the effect of an object appearing and then she pulled it out and brought something else. I don't remember right now, but it kind of caught my attention that, oh, it was good, like cleaned the slide and brought another thing. I don't remember now actually, but I guess what was my question on that? I forgot. So sometimes it is helpful if it's not, so it was better for me to pay attention when it got away. But what was the issue with that? Oh, if it's gonna stagger and then come back to it later.
Yeah, so that really has more to do with, do you need that information that appeared earlier to be relevant to later in the talk, right? Because if let's say it appeared in the first 10 seconds of the talk and you took it away, but it's actually important at the last 30 seconds of the talk, you might want to consider bringing it back a little bit sooner, or keeping it on the screen, right? So that it remains relevant. And so that, much like a lot of what we talked about today, it's a judgment call in terms of how your talk is structured, right? And how the visual is kind of crucial to certain parts of the talk, or is it kind of an underlying image you want to kind of carry out throughout the 3 minutes?
Would you recommend an image for a geographic area that's not known really well?
I would think so. I mean, if it's helpful, right? I guess it would depend on the relevance and the significance of the geographic area for the talk.
Okay.
Right. You want to think about, how important it is that we know the shape of this.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. We have a question about videos, embedding a video for video analysis. Instead of showing the entire video, I'll show some snapshots. Do you have better suggestions? We did have a finalist use a video, but it was a very short video. Am I remembering that correctly?
I think it was Kelsey used like a very quick video.
Yeah. And even then, just to make note, like if you want to embed something, please let us know, because in Kelsey's case in particular, when we had the rehearsal, we found that very short clip provided us with challenges in playing it. It actually was not working initially, and we had to like switch to a more powerful computer on site. We had to use a gaming computer to get it to work. So the AV team had to switch out the computer we were using on site. So that is something to know if you're planning to embed any videos. It might be a challenge come semifinals or the final competition. So I would actually say don't do it, only because if for some reason we can't get it to work, how is that going to affect you? Do you really need it? Because if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and we're not going to get it to work. So we don't have a lot of time to try and get it to work, especially during semis. So we have a quick turnover on the 2 rounds. So, and we have very limited AV capability during the semis. So finals, maybe not so much, but definitely during semis. If something is not working right during your presentation, we have very little time to try and fix it on site. So it may work for you while you're using your computer, but with ours, we will bring our laptop, and if it doesn't work on our laptop, we don't have a lot of time to fix it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I
Okay.
will probably just use snapshots or screenshots of the
Yeah.
video.
Yeah,
thank you so
screenshots would probably be fine, but
much.
yeah,
Mhm,
for anyone who might be thinking of embedding any sort of audio or video,
mhm.
please let us know, because the size can definitely be a challenge, like just in terms of AV.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? All right. Well, we have tons of examples from in form of video, but also the PDF of this slide of the presentation, and also a recording of this will be available. Lisa, I believe there is a way to check the 16. It's the other way around. You want 16 to 9, not 9 to 16. And I believe that is under, ooh, I am blanking right now where I can see it. If you have the newer PowerPoints, like 2016 and on, it should be the default.
It's under the, sorry, hope you don't mind me jumping in, Francesca. It's under the design tab in PowerPoint, and then on the top right of the ribbon, there should be slide size, and it should say widescreen, which is 16:9.
Yeah.
I believe that should be the default.
Yeah, it's right here under design tab, slide size, and it's usually the default 16:9. I think you can probably see how odd the 4:3 is, just because I don't think it's been used very widely in the last few years.
Yeah, I looked at aspect ratio, so I didn't see it, but I found it. Thank you.
All right, other questions? All right, I'm happy to turn over and close our workshop today. Thank you so much for attending. You will be getting a survey about this workshop. Please fill it out, because it helps inform how we design our workshops for the next cycle. Whatever is useful, please tell us. Whatever is not as useful, also tell us. We would really appreciate that, because we want our workshops to be the reason you want to join Grad Slam, and not the reason you don't want to join Grad Slam. All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming in. Thank you, Francesca, for your time and doing this for us today. Really appreciate it.